Hello, everyone, and welcome to another webinar of the Danish Sound Cluster. Today, I have three special guests, like always. This time is in the topic of ecological momentary assessment, but another take from last week. So the idea is that last week we were focusing more on the results that we can obtain out of this methodology that it is ecological momentary assessment to understand the needs of people with hearing loss. And this week we will we will make kind of a transition from that. We will still touch upon that a little bit, but we will also focus more on the backside of it, on the tools and not only the results of it. So I have actually more than three guests, but we have three speakers. Please welcome to first Florian and Carolina, which are the first ones to talk. Florian is a senior scientist at WS Audiology. And then we will have Jeppe Høj Christensen, a senior scientist at Ericsson Research Center. And the third speaker is Jörg Bitzer, professor at University of Applied Science, Oldenburg, and he's also with his co-panelists and colleagues, Inge Holube and Jule Pohlhausen. I hope I said that correctly. Yes, I won't take too much of your time because it's much more interesting when the others are talking. I gave you a brief on the topic. Hopefully you were also here last week, so you understand the flow. I just have some technicalities, like always. The process is that we have the three speakers first, and then in the end, we have the Q&A where the speakers can take your questions. Now, there is the Q&A section in the bottom, so you just have to press that. So don't ask your questions in the chat, ask them in the Q&A section. You press down there, you write your question, and then in the end, we have a list of questions we'll go through. So that's the process. We have the three talks and then the Q&A at the end. And also, just so you know, whenever you quit the webinar, there's a small survey at the end that we would really appreciate if you guys could just spend 1 minute filling it out so we can constantly improve the quality of these webinars. So I don't take any more time. It's more interesting if Florian starts talking. So welcome, Florian. And then whenever you want, you can share your screen and we can start the magic.
Thanks. Let me share the screen and give me a thumbs up if we are there.
You just have to close. Yeah, exactly. Perfect.
All right, perfect. Yeah, first of all, thanks for having me, or thanks for having us, so to speak. Because as you can see on the slide, of course, all the stuff that I'm talking about today is not done by myself. It was pretty much a group effort of the people you see in the top right corner. So we're the Orga Europe External Research Lab of former Widex, so to speak. And since the merger together with Sivantos, we are part of the scientific audiology team for WS Audiology. And I think we have been working as a team that we are, with Josefina and Petra as audiologists, and Carolina and myself as engineers in the team for many, many years, also on the top of EMA. And I think we started doing EMA stuff already before it was in the format that we are right now, with fancy web tools and mobile phones and those applications, and doing all those EMA stuff already with pen and paper versions and so on. So we have gathered quite some expertise in that field. What I'm talking about today is going to be how we assess something that we call auditory reality, and also hearing aid preference or hearing aid program preference in the moment using EMA. And let's get into it. And yeah, as I said in the title, and also the expression auditory reality is going to be mentioned a couple of times by me throughout the presentation. And What we mean by that is that when we use that, that was inspired by the term being coined by Noble in 2008, and we modified it a little bit to our context. But what we mean by auditory reality is basically the variety of acoustical environments experienced by an individual. And we pretty much focus on that experience side of it. It's not only looking at acoustics, but looking at other stuff like like mood and the tasks and intentions people have, and how they experience the situation, not just measuring acoustics. And we think it's an important part of, and for us it's a core part of EMA, because of course in EMA you can research hundreds and thousands of different research questions, and you can measure things like listening effort or speech intelligibility and those things. But I think one of the main reasons why we do EMA and send people out in their real lives and in the field is because we want to learn more about those actual situations where they make those assessments. So that's why we think in all our EMA stuff, there's this core part of auditory reality mapping before we go into more of the research questions. And we wanted to do this auditory reality mapping in some sort of a structured way, since as we've heard last time in the last seminar as well, we don't really have a standardized way of asking questions and mapping people's auditory reality and try to figure out and understand those situations people report on. So we went back and tried to find out how can we do that in a more structured way and ask the right questions regarding this. And on that journey, we sort of stumbled upon something that is actually standardized. And as you can see here in the picture, there's an ISO standard about the soundscape framework. And that is the framework that basically shows you the elements of how a soundscape is built up. So it's usually used by environmental planners and city planners when they talk about, I don't know, new parks or a shopping mall or a new marketplace, and try to figure out how is the soundscape supposed to be shaped in that. And I'll walk you just quickly through that because it was quite influential for us when we came up with the system, how we structured the search for auditory reality in EMA. So I think quite traditionally in our field, we basically start here, and pretty much it's about the sound sources we have to do with. And of course, the sound sources in the place they emit sound, which is then altered by the acoustic environment through reflections and absorption and all the stuff. And from there, it reaches our ears and we get some sort of auditory sensation. Since we are working for a hearing aid company, we actually put this little hearing device thing in that framework. It's not an original standard, but we put it in here because of course it's meaningful for us. From that auditory sensation, once you hear and get the sensation of everything that happens in the soundscape, you make some sort of an interpretation of what you just heard and process that. And that leads to a response, which could either be some sort of long-term outcome, maybe like I will never go to that soundscape or to that situation again because it's simply too noisy, or something like oh, my hearing aid worked so nicely, I will always take my hearing aid to that situation. But it also can have some short-term consequences and responses, and they go back to this big box, which I ignored for now, but I think was the most influential for our work, because it shows there's this really big box which is called context. And by context in that standard, they claim the context is things like intentions, activities, people's tasks and attitudes that they have in that situation, but also experiences. And as you can see by all the arrows, the context is pretty much central to this model, and it has an impact on the sound sources themselves. For example, given we have a football arena and on game day, there would be a lot of people cheering and so on, and you have those sound sources. On a non-game day, it's pretty quiet in there. So the context has an effect on what sound sources actually are there. But it also has an impact on how we perceive the sound, how we interpret the sound, and how we react to it. A little bit back to what Nadia maybe talked about last seminar, when people try to modify their listening situation by maybe moving closer to a speaker or moving away from a very loud sound source and so on. So the context is a quite central part to it, and we use that and had that as a ground for trying to find a structured way of looking into auditory reality. What we did in the first place is that we took this context-based approach and did a large literature study where we sort of extracted data from many studies which were out there in the field, where test participants in that studies reported about their own listening situations in everyday life themselves. And we then started to categorize those reports that we had from the literature and build that common sound scenario framework, which you see here, which starts with a top level where we could categorize those situations that we had from the data in speech communication situations, in focused listening, and in more non-specific listening as an intention. And then we further divided those categories into actual task categories, looking into what are the actual listening tasks people have to solve in those situations. And in terms of speech communication, we have one-to-one conversations, we have sort of group conversations, and we can also have conversations through devices, through phones or Teams calls and so on. On the focused listening side, we could divide it also into different subcategories. Then we have the tasks of people listening to live sounds, where we usually don't have so much control about over the sound source, like being in a theater or some sort of lecture or something like this. But also the typical through device focused listening, like to music through a stereo or watching TV, listening to the radio and so on. What we also found is even in those situations where you don't focus on sound or not in a speech communication situation, even there we could find some subcategories. So we, of course, to the very right, we have those listening tasks where you are really passively listening or perceiving what is happening around you. While there's also something where you're a little bit more alert, where you're not actively listening to something, but where you kind of monitor the sound to see if you have to change your behavior, because it has some sort of meaning to your actually current activity that you're doing. And just to finish that framework, we also, from the data that we got from all the literature, we also could show some data on the occurrence of those task situations, of the difficulty and the importance to hear well in those. And we come a little bit back to that later on, because that also is something we use in our EMA studies. As you can see here, it's an example, just an excerpt of part of a question that we use in our EMA studies. There you see, once again, that one part of the questions, or one question that we have in our EMA questionnaires, is actually letting people categorize the currently reported listening situation in one of the task categories of the cost framework. You might notice there are 6 instead of 7. We found that it's easier for people to, the last category, which is monitoring or passive listening, sometimes it's easier for people to have them as a combined category. But I think we started off doing EMA studies with asking people about describing a situation. That's, of course, something that you can always do. You do an EMA, prompt people and ask them, describe your current situation. But I think we all agree that the average test participants have a difficulty to put their sound or the experience of a sound scenario into words. And sometimes you get in those free text questions in email, you get quite some extensive text, but you can also have people saying, basically sitting at home, and you don't really get much out of such description. So we found that this categorization in the cost categories really gave us some structured way of letting people explain what type of listening tasks they are currently in. And that part is actually one of the recommendations that was mentioned that's going to be published from this work group, which is focusing on finding some sort of standardized way, or at least recommending ways of doing EMA. So let's get to some study results where we actually used that way of categorizing people's auditory reality. So we, quite some time ago, did a study with 10 elderly hearing impaired participants, and we sent them out for 2 one-week field trial periods where we equipped them with a study phone. And as you can see here, that was back in the days before we had sort of our own tools, or without having access to those fancy online tools and new tools that you have publicly available right now. So we basically at that time took a mobile phone, and we had the Google Forms questionnaire on that, and some sort of reminder application to have some sort of low-key EMA system. With that system, we prompted them to do EMA reports every 1.5 hours, and they could also self-initiate reports. And I think the core, on top of auditory reality data, was for that study to let people compare 2 different hearing aid settings in the moment for each of their reports. And what you can see here is that the basic difference between the 2 hearing aid settings that we had, settings A and setting B, is basically a gain reduction in the mid-frequency range. So that perspective, we could make sure that people could possibly hear a difference in all kind of different situations. So it's not the noise reduction or something that is dependent on the actual input. It's more on a global change. If we jump right into results, and I think what you see here in this picture is, or would be, results that we traditionally would look in without maybe having EMA, and especially without having the information about the auditory reality of the people, of those common sound scenario task categories that people are in. So as you can see here in the graph, people could, for every time they got a prompt, they had to do a pair comparison of the two hearing aid settings in the moment. And they could say, I prefer setting B, I prefer setting A, or I don't hear a difference, or I hear difference, but I don't have a preference. And I think if we would look at that picture with all the data pooled like this, and from a hearing company perspective, we would say probably, okay, if we have to go for setting A, or if we go for setting B based on our results, we would probably have setting A implemented in the hearing aids. But then we used actually the information that we got from adding this auditory reality data to our EMA, and looked how is the preference distribution looking like in each of the 7 cost task categories. And if we do that in this more detailed way, you can see that in the speech communication situations, as well as in the focused listening situations, we see a similar pattern of setting A being preferred over B in most of the times. But what we also could see is that in the non-specific situations, there suddenly we have more preference for the setting B. And that makes it, of course, much more versatile to interpret those type of data, and to gain some insights which we wouldn't have had if we wouldn't have looked in the auditory reality and connect the preference data with the auditory reality data. So the question is, we then ask the question, what's the advantage of focusing on auditory reality and using the EMA methodology and those two in combination? So first of all, as I said, we have this old system where we sort of get together bits and pieces from Google Forms and from a reminder Android application and so on, and put those together. But you're not quite flexible with that because you sort of depend on those third-party tools that you have. So first of all, we took all the knowledge that we got from those studies and actually developed our own WideX EMA system at that time, which also could connect to WideX hearing aids, and we could do the pair comparisons of different programs directly in the app and so on. So everything was much easier. But since the merger, we of course had suddenly both the WideX EMA app and the Siventus EMA app, which Nadia presented during the last webinar. So we kind of merged those two together and took all the advantages from both sides and tried to make an improved version of a joint EMA application. And that's what we're using currently in our studies. But more from a company, hearing a company, or also clinical perspective, the advantages of using the system that we used in those questions is of course also other things, like, for example, here, the first one, development of hearing aids. With those insights, which I just showed, for example, it's easy for us to not look sort of on an overall level. Is there a setting or A or B which is preferred? But we could look into those adaptive features. Are there certain situations and certain tasks where setting A or setting B is better, and make sort of those adaptive features a little bit more sensitive to people's auditory reality. But we also, I think we have improved in terms of evaluation of hearing aids and hearing performance. So we don't only go to those artificial lab setups and try to find out if a feature works in one way or other. We much more either go into the field and do EMA-like studies to evaluate our hearing aids and performance. But we also have to take this knowledge back into the lab and try to adapt our lab procedures to make them more ecologically valid. And from a clinic perspective, of course, we could use this auditory reality data to understand a little bit more about the individual, and could do some fitting and fine-tuning, which is more adapted to an individual's personal auditory reality rather than to a group of hearing impaired. And also when a clinician or an audiologist would demonstrate hearing aid features, you could focus on those features which are actually relevant for that specific person, rather than looking on a group level. So I think there are some more concrete examples where EMA, and maybe in connection with the auditory reality included, has an advantage in our field. But we didn't also only use our own tools. We actually started a study many years ago, which was then struck by COVID, and we had to pause that because auditory reality was still a central part of that. And as we all know, we lived our lives a little bit differently during that time. So that was paused for quite a while, but we are now finished with that data collection, and I'm going to send you, or going to show you some preliminary data of that study as well. Why I want to go into that study is because for that study, we used actually a tool which was not an own in-house developed product, but we used a tool which was called Ethica. But that's sort of a quite versatile platform for doing EMA studies, which you can access publicly online. And in terms of general functionality of that tool is that you can, it's first of all available on all platforms. You can run it in a browser, but you can also download it as an Android or an iOS app. And you can set it up on your own sort of study devices, but you could also just let people download it to their own phones and have it administered from that perspective. The Ethica application has a quite good online experiment interface where you actually manage your entire EMA study. So I think it would work pretty well for people that don't have at all experience with EMA studies. So I think it's a quite straightforward tool where you handle everything from participant management to questionnaire and outcome measure design for the EMA study, but also manage all the prompt and reminder things. And you can actually, since it's in a cloud, sort of have a real-time monitoring of data that is coming in, just to see that the study progresses as expected. Then you also have a way of exporting all the data totally, but also have some specific exports of some part of the data. And you could, if you would like to even do the analysis of your data in that tool. Recently, they even added the possibility to have some sort of remote chat, and you can give some remote reporting with video calls to the people that are included in the study if they have some issues with their phone and so on. So it's a quite nice tool. And here you see just an example of in that tool how you would design your questionnaire. So it's a quite straightforward way of doing it. You would simply, you have all different kind of options. You can use text questions. You have multiple choice questions. You can add scales to it, or image questions, and there are a couple of more. So you would basically just drag them here and organizing them in the way you want to have your questionnaire. And in terms of functionality, they have everything you would actually need for an EMA study. You can do conditional formatting or skip logic, which means you can have questions that unlock based on replies from previous cached questions, and you can jump between different questions in the questionnaire based on answers. So it's quite flexible in that perspective. You can have multiple language versions in case you do some multi-center studies with that tool. You have some quite extensive randomization you can do. So you can randomization the questions in the questionnaire themselves. You can randomize answer options for single questions and so on. So they're quite flexible in there. You can program things like expiry times. If you want a questionnaire, if it's prompted to be available, let's say only 5 minutes after it was prompted, or you can give people an hour to respond and so on. You can make all those settings. Something that we also used in our study, which I'm going to show you in a minute, is you can also have location capture for each of the reports. So you could actually get GPS location for each EMA report. Just to give you an idea about some additional features which can be used with this Ethica application, is you can use quite a lot of those motion sensors that you have in the phone or that you have on a wearable. So you can integrate that Ethica application with Apple Watches and Fitbits and other Google Fit compatible stuff. And they also are building more and more cognitive tasks in that. So if you want to have an EMA study where you let people do cognitive tasks during their reports, you can do that, use those that they have, or design your own. So it's a quite flexible tool. We use that tool to do a study which still had this auditory reality focus, but also is focusing on avoidance. And this time we looked a little bit from a different perspective, because what we presented from our previous and earlier EMA studies would be results a little bit like this in terms of auditory reality. So we would look at the data and just show of all the reports, what is the distribution of those reports in the cost intention categories, so speech, conversation, focused listening, or non-specific listening. And I think we, in the beginning, but also people in conferences when we present the work, react to those numbers that are here that look quite similar in different studies. And just showing that people, maybe just 30% of the times, are in speech conversation situations, and more than 40% are in sort of non-specific situations without focusing on sound and conversations and so on. And we usually get this comment, well, of course, that's because the population is hearing impaired, and they probably avoid a lot of those situations. And we are sort of lacking a little bit evidence for that claim. And I think that was sort of the trigger for this study, because the study was designed in a way that we, for it, we actually had 3 different participants groups. We had a group of elderly hearing impaired, a group of elderly normal hearing, and a group of young normal hearing people, just to look into the effects of age, but also of hearing status. And we sent them out for a 1-week EMA trial with 7 prompts per day. But they can, of course, also always start their own reports, so they can report as much as they want, but they were prompted 7 times a day. And the EMA questionnaire included questions of auditory reality in the way that I showed before, categorizing in terms of the cost categories. But we also asked questions about avoidance. We actually provided them with a microphone attached to their clothes and connect to the mobile phone to make sound level recordings. And as I mentioned before, we geotagged all of their reports, so we get GPS location for each of the reports, of course, before you're asking with their consent, of course. And if you remember, if you look a little bit at the data that we get out of this study with the Ethica tool, one part that we always ask in our EMA questionnaires is this information regarding occurrence, difficulty, and importance of the situations in the different cost task categories. As some sort of cross-validation, of course, as well, to see if something is completely off, if our data looks completely different as the common sound scenario framework, or the other way around, just to get a feel of how valid is the data. And what I want to focus on is the question about frequency of occurrence. So in every EMA questionnaire, so when people get a prompt to report, they have to answer the question, in the situation that you're right now, how often does this situation usually occur in your everyday life? And you might argue, well, you could, of course, calculate those occurrences from your EMA data and just look how much data you have in the one or the other category. But of course, it might happen that there are people are suddenly in situations which usually don't occur so often, but maybe this week they occurred frequently because there was, I don't know, there was a film festival in town. They went to the cinema 3 times a week or something like this. Then that would of course skew the distribution that you see in the data. But if we ask the question like this, you get a better feel for if people actually were in the situations they usually are in. And I think when we look at the graph, we are quite happy in how the distribution looks like, because we get what we want. We basically get the daily reports for daily situations, because that's of course the main ideas of the EMA, that we want to know what people do in everyday life. But we also don't miss out on those situations that only happen weekly or maybe even monthly or less. So I think it's a quite good coverage of everyday life listening. Then what about avoidance? How would we tackle this problem and see if one or the other group avoids a lot of those maybe difficult situations? And can we trust in the data we get from only a group of hearing impaired? So one of the questions that we ask in the EMA study is there background noise present in your current situation? And if yes, how annoying is that background noise? And as you can see here in the distributions for the elderly hearing impaired, for the elderly normal hearing, and for the younger normal hearing, is if you look at those 2 groups of the elderly first, that there's not much of a difference in terms of noisiness of their situation to report, and yeah, noise presence and noise annoyance, they're pretty similar. So it seems that there's not really an effect of avoidance in terms of noisiness for those groups. The only effect that we see is for the younger group, that they seem to draw a different line on where they think there's noise presence, but it's not annoying, while the elderly groups rather say there's no noise present. When we have to look a little bit more closer to that. So as I mentioned before, this is preliminary data, so don't draw any conclusions yet on the data that I show. All the data I showed before is, of course, subjective data, and we, of course, have the opportunity to get some more objective data in an EMA as well. And in our case, it were the sound levels which I mentioned. Though people were provided with a microphone, and they were supposed to wear that microphone during the entire EMA time. And what we were doing with the microphone is that we continuously were logging sound levels through that system. That means that every 30 seconds we registered the momentary level, but at the same time we also recorded the average and peak levels of the last two minutes. So what you see here in that graph is those average levels for each of the 3 test participant groups. And even there, we could see that on an objective level of sound levels, we don't see much of a difference between the elderly hearing impaired and the elderly normal hearing group. It's a little bit quieter for the younger normal hearing. And that can have to do with an interesting aspect of designing your EMA study as well. That in our case, we had fixed times for the EMA period. So people got prompts for doing the EMA reports from 8 in the morning to 8 in the evening. And if, for example, the younger group would go on to parties like 10 or 11 in the evening, that wouldn't be captured. So I think we might explore a little bit more those tools and opportunities that we have to actually find maybe individual times of letting people doing their EMA reports to capture what is important in their lives. But as I said, in terms of sound levels, we don't see really a big difference between those groups. But we might not forget that when we're talking about avoidance, there might be different ways of avoidance. But what we're looking with here is maybe that if people altogether avoid situations because of their hearing loss or because of something else. But of course, we also have something that Nadia from last webinar also touched upon. Maybe we have some sort of reactivity. Maybe people are avoiding certain situations because they don't want to make EMA reports. So they want to take out their phone and make some questionnaire reports in that situation. So that's something that we might want to look in as well. And we ask some questions regarding that in our study as well. And the last objective data I wanted to show from that study is, as I mentioned, that we geotagged every report that the person gave just to get some sort of rough mobility estimates and see if those different groups, the elderly normal hearing and hearing impaired and the younger normal hearing, if they move differently, if they have a sort of a larger variance in the places that they visit. So we basically just calculated the geographically distance between each of an individual report and see how it looks on the group level. And even though in terms of, as you can see in the graph, so you have the first one for the hearing impaired, the first one for the elderly normal hearing, and the last one for the younger normal hearing. And if we look at the medians, which is sort of the line between the lighter and the darker shade here, they're quite similar between the groups. So we don't really have this large effect of the one group of the hearing impaired, for example, just stays at home and it's in a quite safe environment. They don't move so much outside of their comfort zone. We don't really see that. Something that we will definitely look a little bit more into is that we, on top of age and hearing status, we also asked people before they started the study if they're living alone or if they're cohabitant with someone. And if we look at the data and from that perspective, it looks like as if the people being cohabitant, the darker bars here compared to the lighter bars here, it seems like that they have that they are to more of a degree mobile than the other people. So they're moving more distances, more in different places between the email reports, and that is true for each of the 3 groups. So that's definitely something that we're going to look into a little bit more closely when we finalize the data analysis. But I think it's a good example of how you can actually combine the individual data that we get and the subjective data with also some objective data by sensors, or in that case, that we have the GPS locations from the phone. And that's actually everything that I want to show from our data. And I think it might be a good transition to what Jeppe and Jörg's going to talk about, because they are talking a lot more also about different systems and sensors and objective data that can be collected with EMA and EMA systems. So that's it from me, and yeah, thank you for your attention, and looking forward to hear Jörg and Jeppe talking. Thank you.
Great, really cool with the Ethica tool. I think I'll ask a few questions later. But without further ado, let's just go to Jeppe.
Yes. I'll share my screen right away.
Yes.
Yeah. All right. And interrupt if there's any problems, but
yes,
it should be sharing now.
It's all good.
Thanks. So I think there will be some overlaps from Florian's, but also we have a little bit of a different perspective on it. So I think that's gonna spur some good discussions. My name is Jeppe, and I've been at Ericsson Research Center the last 4.5 years, mainly working on deriving audiological insights from data we can log with hearing aids and all types of sensors, basically. And I'll talk about how we can combine EMAs with such objective data. Now, the overall research aim of what I'm going to present is that we want to ensure that hearing loss interventions can actually provide impact in the real world and not just in the laboratories. So it's a very different situation sitting in a sound dead booth and then walking around in the traffic. And we also saw Florian talk a lot about how context impacts the auditory perception. And to do that, we need some kind of outcome measures from the real world that can tell us if something is working or not. And one of the overall problems here is that EMAs cannot stand alone because they are subjective, they are intrusive, and they're also highly contextual. And one of the solutions to this is to actually use the objective data to qualify these experiences that we can record. Now, I'll just step a little bit back into the theoretical parts. How do we actually understand hearing in the real world? Now, much like cognition and perception of other things, hearing is embodied and situated. So again, we hear differently according to where we are, what we're doing, who's looking at us, for example. And that also means that we cannot really infer much from isolated mechanisms that we can measure with controlled manipulations, such as the hint test or something like that. We cannot really infer how that will impact us in the real world. And instead, we have been looking into ecology-based methods. So basically deriving insight from observational data, behavioral changes, bodily responses, so physiological signals, and always making sure that we know what what is the scene, the soundscape you're in, what is your motivations, and all these details. So that's sort of like our theory behind doing this. An example of ecology of hearing is, I mean, ecology research is mostly concerned with animals. So a natural place to start it with the fish. And here you can see how the ecology of fish hearing is actually mapped out by looking at what kind of frequency range do these different species of fish communicate in. And that actually maps well with how they are coexisting in different oceans. Now you can also ask the question, well, what about all the boats that we send around? How does that actually interfere with these species of fish? And it turns out that it interferes with all of them because the frequency spectrum is covering everything. We have done a couple of years back, we've done a little bit of a similar thing with airplane pilots, basically asking what are the hearing problems of airplane pilots. And what we did was we mapped out the sound environments. So you can see here on the y-axis the sound pressure level of a typical workday. So arriving at the plane, all these technical terms, pushback, that's when the plane leaves the tarmac. And then you can see a sharp increase from takeoff to cruising, and then sort of like a stable level and then landing. It's a short trip, this one. I think it's a domestic flight. When we look at the sound pressure levels, they're fairly high. And when we look at the frequency spectrum of it, see that black line over here, that you can actually see that it covers quite well the typical spectrum of speech. And the blue one here is the typical shouting spectrum, and you can barely break the barrier. So of course, it's hard to talk with your co-pilot when you're sitting cruising in the airplane. And to take this one step further, we also measured the heart rate of these pilots. There was 5 pilots across 18 flights in total. And we could see that when you are in the cockpit and you experience this really high noise, then when we divide it into the low periods and the high periods, so half of the time the noise is below the average and half of the time the noise is above the average, there's also a big change in the heart rate. So basically how elevated is your heart rate from rest. And this would indicate that actually this additional noise in the cockpit is kind of stressing. So it's a way to map out a potential problem here. Now back to the more geological relevant stuff, we've sort of like more or less developed this kind of methodology that we use at Ericsson now to do these field studies with EMA. And it consists of these elements. So first of all, we have to ensure a triangulation of measures. Like one measure cannot stand alone. So we need both the experiences and motivation. So this is the EMA part, but also people can rate their listening intentions, for example. But it has to be combined with objective data in order to actually make sense. So objective data here, we usually look at the sound data recorded by the hearing aids. So the sound level, the SNR, but also the wear time, and actually also in behavior in terms of are you turning up or down the volume. And then lastly, we've been starting to look a lot about the physiological outcomes. Does that actually support or not support the other kinds of findings? we try to use unobtrusive and seamless technology, so it's not a burden on the user. And also, most of it is commercially available, so that it's easy to use, easy to acquire, and doesn't really interrupt in the daily life otherwise. And I think most crucially, we need to actually apply multi-level statistical modeling. And by this, I mean that if I want to know how the noise in my car impacts my experiences and maybe my health, I also need to know what time of day I'm driving the car, because it has a different impact if it's in the morning or after a long work day. But it also might make a difference if it's on a Friday or Sunday afternoon. So we have different levels in this kind of data that we need to account for. So I'll show some of the examples of how we use this methodology, and I'll just present a few studies or some highlight from some studies to actually sort of like exemplify it. So the first one is about how we use the sound data from the hearing aids to contextualize specific hearing aid benefits. So this is a recent study that I was involved in. Data has been collected at the University of Manchester. And here, one of the goals was to figure out, can we measure any kind of benefits between two premium hearing aids? One has traditional noise reduction, and the other one has a very new neural network-based noise reduction. So this is where you have a network that's trained on a million different sound scenes, and maybe that can produce some kind of more superior noise reduction. So 40 hearing aid users through normal clinical flow was recruited, and half of them were giving either hearing aid 1 or hearing aid 2 for 2 weeks, and then remaining 2 weeks they switched and tried the other hearing aids. And then in the end, we had 17 preferring the traditional noise reduction and 23 preferring the noise reduction with the artificial intelligence. Now, during these weeks, they conducted EMAs. So this is a snapshot of the screenshot, and I will actually just focus on the first 2 questions, because it turned out that so there were 6 questions in total targeting different kinds of auditory perceptions. But in the end, all the responses we got were highly correlated. So it might not be easy for these test participants to actually figure out whether they can focus well, but also hear well in the same situation. And that's why we focused on the 2 first questions. The first rating was, how noisy is it? And also, how satisfied are you with the sound right now? So that's sort of the main one. And then they could also, with this menu, choose what kind of intention they have. Are you in a one-person conversation, and so on. And much like Florian's work, this is also something that they were prompted on the phone every morning at 8 o'clock and then throughout the day, but also it was self-initiated. And actually it turned out that most of the EMAs we got ended up being self-initiated. This is an overview of all the data. So there was in total a bit more than 3,500 EMAs. And you can see how they are here distributed across the day from 6 in the morning to midnight in these categories of listening intentions. And I've tried to color them in these common sound scenarios that Florian talked about. So we can see that, yeah, a lot of it is focused listening, especially in the evening. And that's, of course, the television part. But otherwise, non-specific is mostly, doing the active hours of day. And then this speech communication also has a fairly big amount of share. So we could use this to first of all, just to understand what kind of situations are these people in, but also to map out that actually it didn't differ between the hearing aid models. So at least we can control for people having been in different situations by doing that. Down here is their sound exposure. So one thing, of course, is their self-reported listening intention, but we also measured the sound exposure. So whether you are in a high signal-to-noise ratio, high sound pressure level environment, and then these 4 categories differ, sort of like you can say that the lowest one here is maybe the hardest one to be in, or a very quiet condition. The yellow here might be the hardest one to be in, low signal-to-noise ratio and high sound pressure levels. That would indicate a lot of background noise. So the first thing we did was to examine, okay, how do the ratings you're doing actually correlate, or how are they a function of the sound environment you're experiencing? And again, the first question here was the ratings of noisiness. How noisy was it? And you can see here that when the sound pressure level goes up, so does the noisiness ratings. This is predictions from the statistical model. You can also see that these lines are fairly overlapping, so there's not really a big difference in these 2 hearing aid models. When we look at the signal to noise ratio, it's a negative relationship, which also makes sense that if it's a higher signal to noise ratio, you would rate it to be less noisy. And again, it's similar for the two hearing aid models. So we would sort of like interpret this as saying you have access to the same kind of environmental cues with these two hearing aid models. It's a little bit different when we then look at the satisfaction ratings. Here, the satisfaction ratings are negatively impacted by the sound pressure level, which might also make sense that you are probably in a more noisy condition when you have higher sound pressure levels. And especially for the signal to noise ratio, we find this big difference between the hearing aid models. So the traditional noise reduction hearing aid 1 here, you can see that it's actually increasing with SNR. So meaning that you also have worse ratings when you have a lot of background noise. But for the other hearing aid, it's actually unaffected by SNR. So there's a clear change in behavior and change in experience with these two. And we can interpret this as saying that with your wearing hearing aid 2, you actually have you can call it a lower susceptibility towards background noise with this. Now, as I said before, it cannot really stand alone. We need other kind of measures to sort of like support this. We looked at a behavioral measure to see if we could find that corroborated with these findings or not. We know that when you're changing the volume throughout the day, this can actually indicate that you are compensating for listening conditions that your hearing aid is not really helping you with. So for example, if it's really quiet, you would turn up the volume. If it's really noisy, you would turn down the volume. In our case, this also supported the previous finding. So on the left here, you can see the amount of hearing aid volume changes throughout these 4 weeks. And you can see that it's fairly similar with the two hearing aid models. But how they were made were very different. So again, hearing aid 1 here, you can see that when SPL sound pressure levels go up, you turn down the volume. When the sound signal to noise ratio goes up, you turn up the volume, and vice versa. So again, you're reacting highly to the environment. But that's not the case for the other hearing aids. You have flat lines. So we can interpret this as saying that whatever volume adjusting you're doing with the noise reduction of the hearing aids 2 is actually not in response to the environment. So it might be in response to different kinds of intentions or situations instead. Lastly, because they were asked for the final preference in this study, so they decided basically with what hearing aid they wanted in the end. We could also measure, well, how well can we actually predict that with the EMAs? And also, are there certain elements of the contextual data that give better predictions than others? So what we can do is we can calculate this marginal mean rating from the statistical model saying, okay, the preferred hearing aid that's in green here has a higher rating than the non-preferred hearing aid in this particular condition. So quiet condition, low SNR and low SPL. And when we do that for all the different contextual data, we find this pattern. And to summarize, there's sort of like certain parts of this where we have higher predictive value, meaning that there's a bigger difference between ratings of the preferred and the non-preferred hearing aid. Especially in the low SNR, high SPL conditions, that would be the most complex listening conditions actually. Also, when you're listening to music live, there's a big difference. When you're listening to people talking, there's a big difference. And then lastly, television. So you can say that even though television takes up a lot of the EMAs, especially in the evening time, they are actually also important to find a final preference of a hearing aid. So with that information, you could sort of like shorten your EMA study at least. So that's basically the conclusion of this, is that we can get this lower susceptibility towards background noise by looking at the ratings as a function of sound. And this is also reflected in the behavior from the change in volume. I'll just highlight some other studies, and I guess you will get these slides afterwards. You can find them. But similar studies that also have looked at the association between sound data and EMA ratings. The first by Claudia Andersen. There's one by R.M. Bosman looking at actually volume changes with a high frequency gain program. Indicated that it was basically too loud. People didn't like it. And then lastly, Alessandro Pasta, who looked at how do you actually separate the hearing satisfaction from the usefulness of having different hearing aid settings in the real world. So very interesting study. So that was fast, but I also want to talk about how we can then use physiological measures, and especially what kind of physiological measures relate to hearing in the real world at all. First, you look at the theoretical background, and if you look at this kind of like noise and health literature, we find that it's fairly mapped out how noise actually impacts our body. It can do that by either giving us a direct effect, for example, damaging our hearing organ, or an indirect effect. And that's where it gets interesting for us, because the indirect effects are also the ones that give you annoyance, and you cannot hear. You have to strain extra to actually listen to what's going on. And commonly, we can actually measure this from whatever stress reactions they are providing. So you can say that the stress reactions can either be direct or from indirect noise exposure. And the indirect noise exposure then, you can say like a sub-element of that is that you have to spend extra effort communicating when there's a lot of background noise. So the whole exercise now is to figure out throughout the day, you have a lot of stress. How can we isolate the part of the stress that's actually has something to do with hearing? So that's what we're trying to do now. Some of the first evidence of this was based on observational data from 2019. So Oticon has a program for their users called Hearing Fitness, and basically you can sign up to Hearing Fitness, and then you can get insights about your hearing aid wear and program usage and these things. So the whole idea is that it will log data from the hearing aids, sound data, and environment data. It can also log data from wearables through Apple HealthKit, and then finally give back information. And we can use this data to ask the question, do poorer listening conditions actually associate with higher levels of stress? Because that would be one of the assumptions to test out. This is a snapshot of the data that we used for this study. It was across 3 months of normal hearing aid wear for 64 users. And first of all, you can see that it's highly, varying in terms of their sound pressure levels they're experiencing, their signal to noise ratios, but also their heart rate from almost resting heart rate to above 100. And you can also see there's clear separation from this automatic hearing aid classified soundscape. So quiet, speech to noise, and noise in more or less all of the acoustic data, but also in the heart rate, it looks like it's actually shifting a bit. And of course, that could be because when you're in noise, you're just walking down, the road, so you probably have a higher pulse. So it's more interesting to look at the actual associations between the continuous sound pressure level in SNR and the change in heart rate. And this is, again, the summary of all this data. What we found was that if you look at the heart rate throughout the day, then around 5% of their change, the variance throughout the day, can be explained by SPL and SNR alone. And you can see how they are associating down here. So the first one here is the heart rate versus the sound pressure level. And you can see it's a very linear relationship. And that has been found also in previous studies, this very strong linear relationship. But what's new is that the signal to noise ratio they experience and actually have a negative impact on heart rate. So especially when you're in a loud environment and you have good SNR, then you actually have a lower heart rate than if you have a bad SNR. So that would indicate us that there's something to do with also the quality of the sound you're in terms of listening. We correlated for movement, we controlled for movement by looking at the relative GPS coordinates, and that actually didn't have an impact of this. So this should be related to the sound alone. Recently, a PhD student from Odense, Claudia Andersen, is also collecting newer data. Here, it's not purely observational because they are also doing EMAs on top of just collecting data, so we can get some more insights. For example, we can split the data up into the things that have been collected during speech communication in contrasting to the non-specific listening, again referring to this common sound scenario. And interestingly, we see that in speech communication, all these associations are much stronger. So heart rate is stronger associated with SNR and SPL, but also your self-reported experiences are stronger associated with this. So this would indicate that there might be a three-way interaction here that's saying, okay, if you have higher heart rate, if you have worse listening conditions, you have even worse listening experiences. And that's what we'll probably test out. You can also see here that she collected data from both a group of normal hearing, I think 11 younger normal hearing, but also these 11 hearing impaired recruited through normal clinical flow. And if you just look at these two plots, you can see a clear difference between the sort of like that stress reaction to the different sound levels. So again, SNR and SPL. And we can then start to map out, well, can we actually say something about this difference? For example, up here in the worst listening conditions, it seems that the hearing impaired are actually not stressed at all. Is that because they're not engaging in the environment? Here they're a bit more stressed than the normal hearing. Maybe they actually need some kind of extra noise reduction. So we can learn some audiological insight from this data, hopefully. Lastly, we also want to investigate how consistent are these measures actually. Because one thing is, of course, that you can measure this kind of stress response in one user, but does that actually correlate at all with other users? Can we actually say something meaningful and consistently about this? So we took this setup, hearing aids, wearables, and smartphones to New York and asked 22 students to wear it while they were visiting for 4 days. So data logging, and then we could also have highly accurate time-stamped information about what they were actually doing these 4 days. So you can see here, this will be sort of like the the test of whether we can actually have consistency in measures. On the y-axis here, you have the stress. So basically, what is your heart rate from your base, your normal heart rate? And on the x-axis, you have noise. And noise here is then a combination of the sound pressure level and the signal-to-noise ratio. So if you have high sound pressure level, but also high signal-to-noise ratio, you will actually have low noise, and vice versa. Now, the first event here I'll plot is the Somerset. That's basically just the students sitting down for 2 hours listening to lectures. And you can see here one dot is a student, and they are all down here in the low stress, low noise condition, which makes sense, but they're fairly well clustered. In contrast, we can look at this Harry's Italian, a restaurant, very busy, very loud music, sitting at a long table, and you can see that there's much more noise and actually also some stress, except for this person right here. And if you map out all these events, they actually correspond quite well to what you would think is more stressful or not, and what is more noisy and not. And there's kind of a clustering. So we can at least, I know this is unpublished work, of course, but it goes towards the idea that these are actually consistent in groups of people. Before I sum up, I'll just acknowledge some of the collaborators on these projects that collected a lot of the data. From Oticon, Johanna and Juan Camilo, University of Manchester, Gabby, Melanie, and Helen. From SDU, Claudia and Tobias, and from Eriksholm, Nils and Johan. At the end, I'll just summarize what I've been through now. So real-world hearing experiences are diverse and contextual, and our outcome measures should actually account for this. Again, repeating what Florian also mentioned, context is really important, and we need to factor that into our analysis. EMA can actually provide snapshots of our hearing experiences, but we can make it much more sensitive if we also combine it with data logging, as we saw. Referring back to our study about the noise reduction algorithms in the 2 hearing aids, we actually didn't see any difference in the mean ratings of the EMAs. So we needed the sound data to actually separate them. So we need the appropriate statistical models to do that. And that's definitely also a lot of the work we're doing here at Exxon, trying to figure out how can we have models that are effective, but also interpretable. So machine learning have that tendency to become very black box, and we need to ensure that we can actually understand what's going on. Sorry, this way. We saw that actually a change in behavior, which we can capture by device interactions, volume changes, usage, can represent indirect measures of hearing experiences. And if they are positive and cooperating with the EMAs, then we can actually say that this is underlying some kind of intervention benefit. Lastly, physiological recordings can be helpful for understanding both cognitive but also health-related aspects of real-world hearing. So, taking one step further of actually understanding hearing in the real world. If we combine it with sound data logging, we can maybe get to an outcome measure without the need for EMAs and self-reporting. Simply just looking at the correlation between the sound and the changes in heart rate. Thank you for listening, and look forward to the Q&A. Oh, I think you're muted.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Yes. Thank you, Jeppe. That was good. All right, we have a few minutes to go, so let's just jump right on to whenever you want to share.
Okay. I hope you can see.
That's perfect.
Great. Yeah, hello everyone. My name is Jörg. The talk I will present today is been done with Inga and Jule. They are listening as well, and they will answer your question afterwards if there is a special question for them. I will present our system, which is completely self-developed. It's called Omega, and give you some results for the potential to use it for own voice detection. And as usual, we need lots of people to do that, and I would really like to thank them here, because without them we wouldn't be here. And of course, as a university, we need funding, so we have several funding agencies here that supported us during the last 4 to 6 years. Okay. The idea to develop our own EMA system was back 6 years ago, maybe from Inga, and she designed more or less the objectives here. So she said, okay, I really want to do EMA with questionnaires, and the questionnaires should be designable, very flexible, and additionally, I want to collect objective data, audio data, of course, and it should be as close as possible to the real world. So it should be binaural, and the system should be used with hearing aids, so that we can have studies with or without hearing aid users. So of course, if you collect data, you want to analyze the data as well. So we need some analysis tools. And especially in Europe, we have to consider legal aspects if we want to record or monitor the acoustical environment. We have to be sure that we do not record the real words that were spoken. The intelligibility should be 0 to really have the laws, to abide to the laws. Okay. And this is different from all the other talks from Jeppe and Florian, because we are not a company. It should be independent of any company, and it should be as open as possible. So our solution came up after several iterations, and today it consists of 4 parts. The first part is the hardware. That will I explain in a minute. Then there is the Android application, lots of software tools, and a database. And everything can be accessed by you via GitHub. So there's one large repository with several sub-repositories where you can download everything that we developed, and you can see over our shoulders during our development process. So you know exactly what we are doing and when we are doing it. So it's really, really open at the moment. So let's start with the hardware. Our hardware system consists of 2 microphones. They are attached to the temple arms of glasses. Then we have 2 cables to a very small transmitter. And this transmitter has nothing to do but do some processing to get a 60 kilohertz lossless signal via Bluetooth to the Android app. That's all. And the transmission here is Bluetooth with a serial standard, so it's really lossless audio. And any Android device with a Bluetooth 3.0 RF-COM interface can receive this kind of data. So now you have the data on the hardware, and we transmit it to the Android smartphone. And on the Android smartphone, we do not want to record the audio signal. We want to record just features, and we have to be sure that these features do provide privacy. So we thought a little bit about it, and we came up with a very basic set of features. It's just the RMS, the zero crossing rate, and the auto and cross power spectral densities. And of course, you know that from the auto power spectral densities, I can recreate the audio signal more or less. So it would be intelligible. And we thought about subsamplings and reduce the time resolution. And we came up with some tests for privacy preservation to decide what is the best subsampling number. And in the end, we decided to have a smoothing constant and a subsampling of a factor of 8. So in the end, we have just a signal that has sampled with 8 Hertz. So every 125 milliseconds, we save 1 power spectral density. And we can show you that really this leads to unintelligible audio. We've tested this with normal hearing listeners with a standard sentence test at comfortable level. And you can see the recognition score was really close to 0% at 125 milliseconds. And the good thing is, if you look at the publication of Nakajima et al. From 2018, this corresponds really well with their findings with different settings for the audio signal. But as you can see, if you do something with the audio, with the time structure of the audio, and you do something around 100 to 150 milliseconds, then your intelligibility rate drops down to close to 0%. So now we have the audio signal divided into features. We can save this feature in a privacy preserving way. And after that, we want to analyze this system. First, of course, after the objective data, we want to also have questionnaire data. So, of course, our application can have the typical questionnaire things. So you have this adaptive tree. We've just seen that that all the other tools do that as well. You have the typical radio buttons and click buttons and sliders. You can decide if you want to randomize or schedule start, and everything is just defined by one XML file. So it's easy to change, and you can have several questionnaires on the Android phone just as you want to do it. Of course, you can also set when the system starts and end with the assessments. So it's really typical application to do some kind of surveys via EMA. Okay, then you have all the data on the phone, but you need to transport them back to the PC. For that, we have a MATLAB tool. This is a graphical user interface so that everyone can use it. We have, of course, the alternative via a command line interface for those who are more adventurous and like to program things. This tool will provide you with all the needed information if you had a successful day or a successful data collection from your participants, and everything is just stored on your PC afterwards. This tool, because we want to avoid MATLAB in the future, it's a proprietary program. It costs a lot for companies and for others, and so we really want to change everything to Python. And this will happen this year. So it's still ongoing development. So what can you see when at the moment we have some analysis tools for your data in MATLAB. Here you can see at the bottom two lines, you see the power spectral densities over one day. It's from 7 o'clock to 6 p.m. And you can see the typical spectrum over the time and the RMS level. And from these data, we can compute the coherence, because we have also the cross power spectral density between the two microphones. And the coherence is a good estimator for own voice. And the own voice segments, this is OVS at the top. You can see where own voice has been detected, and these are the sections in time where there are some kind of conversation. If there are some clusters in the red dots, you know there is some kind of conversation. For the own voice segmentation, we are quite sure that the results are correct. For the blue lines, which indicates that someone other is talking, we are not completely sure, but it's still a very first guess for it. So you have lots of analysis on your computer with the data you just received from your app. But this is not enough. You need statistical information, and for that you need a database. So the fourth part of the Omega system is a server and client structure. Here you see our database model. I will not go through any detail here. It's a fairly simple model, but still easy to extend for new features. but it's more interesting what you can do with it. So the features of this server and client model here is it combines all the questionnaires and the feature files. It stores everything in the database, and you can query for everything via SQL. But the real cool thing is that the system itself, the server, will compute new features in the background after uploading your data. So you can compute the own voice segments, for example, in the background as background processes for your data, because no one else is doing it. It's just done on the server. If you have any new ideas for new features, then just program it with an easy-to-use plugin API for new features, and everything is Python-based. It's based on Flask, so it's really for those who are well known in Python. It's easy to extend. Okay, let's have an example here to see what you can do with it. Let's say you have a questionnaire every 30 minutes, and you have the RMS and the PSD values stored for 1 day. So you upload the files, and the server computes new feature files, for example, the own voice segments, and for example, the RMS value, but awaited now. And this can be done for the 125 milliseconds blocks. So the server now compute also some statistics. The first one is, for example, what is the percentage of own voice segments in one chunk, so in 60 seconds data. What is the mean RMS value for the 16 seconds data, or the variance, or the loudness, or the octave, the information of 1 kilohertz band of the RMS, whatever you like, whatever you can compute out from your original low-level features. And after that is done, you can now query very interesting, or you can just ask the database for your research, come out with your research questions. For example, you can just ask, okay, please give me all the questionnaires when the own voice segments is at least 20%. So you're really only interested in the questionnaires that are really close to some kind of conversation. Or maybe you're interested in the acoustical environment at the point of the questionnaire. So you just ask the system, give me the PSD, the power spectral densities, for the last 10 minutes before someone finished the survey. Or you can just ask, give me all chunks, the 60 seconds files, where no own voice is in it, because you're not only interested in the acoustical background and not on the own voice parts. Of course, you can do it the other way around as well. Okay, so you have the possibility to really answer your questions in a more specific ways. As I said, Omega is a system under development. We will have new hardware, next generation of hardware. We will, of course, still develop the software, especially avoiding MATLAB is a very big task at the moment. And from our early adopters, we see that we need a better user experience, so we will increase that. And we need more and easier to use analysis tools. And on the server side, this is at the moment just an in-house tool. You can use it, you can download it, but there is no documentation at the moment, so the usage is quite. You really need lots of experience to use it well. So there will be new features, and you can absolutely sure that we will develop it further. And we really need user management in the future, since we want to collaborate more with other research groups to really join the data and get better on more interesting statistics. Okay, the second part of my talk is about own voice detection. There are many applications where you need own voice detection, and we did this with our Omega system. We were interested in acoustic measurements, but you can use own voice for many things, maybe for communication analysis or turn takings. Conversation analysis is a really good second topic here. The binaural setting allows us to use the acoustics because the own voice is really in the middle of the two microphones and it's very close to the microphone. So the real part of the coherence is quite high when the user of the Omega system speaks and all others are different. And I have an example here. If you look at the second row, you can see in the red dotted line, this is the ground truth. So at the beginning, someone else, always when the ground truth, the dotted line is at the top, then someone else is speaking. In the middle, it's really the user of the system. And over time, you can see there is no one is speaking. So the ground truth tells you where our own voice detector should react. And in the last row, in the bottom row, you can see that the own voice detector is quite well. It sometimes detects the other voice as own voice, but especially for this example, we are not sure if there wasn't a some kind of conversation between the two persons in this region. No, we are only sure for the own voice region that really only one person was speaking at that point. So you can see the own voice detection is quite robust and will react to the wearer if this person speaks. The algorithm itself is just the real part. Most of it is a real part of the coherence and some kind of machine learning. Here it's a simple random forest algorithm, so a decision tree, nothing special, no DNN involved here. So it's interpretable. So, okay, what get we out of it for the acoustic measurements? In our study, we had 13 elderly participants. They used our Omega system for 4 days. And we were interested in how much time in a day they really talk. So we estimated the own voice segments in percent in 5 minutes intervals, and this is the average over all people. And the area that is lightly red is the 10 to 90% percentile, and the line itself is the median here. So what you can see is it's around 10% on all over the day. If you really average this over all days and over 13 people, it's around 9 to 10%. And this correspond quite well to other studies for elderly people. For younger people, it's a little bit higher. For people really working in offices and have to talk much like teachers, it's even higher. But for elderly people, this is a typical normal value as an average for own voice. Then this next was to measure the acoustic environment. So the sound pressure level over 1 day, and the same 13 elderly participants here, and we computed the A-weighted average sound pressure level again over 5 minutes intervals. And what you see here is that it makes a difference if you measure it with or without the own voice segments. So of course, without the own voice segments, the overall average is lower. It's just 2 to 3 dB, but it's still significant. And you should really consider own voice or to exclude own voice in your measurements. And I will come to that in more detail in a minute. What else is interesting here, the exposure is more or less constant over a typical day. There are no highlights, no lowlights over the time. And this value is a little, it's a little bit quieter in Oldenburg, it seems, compared to Stockholm, when we compare these data to what we just saw from Jeppe. So I think I really like this kind of comparison. I was surprised about the high levels in his studies. So, but we know that Oldenburg is a quiet city, so that fits. Okay, let's have a better look at the data here on the left side, and this is really important. What you can see in this diagram is on the x-axis, you see the mean level over 10 seconds, including the parts that are own voice. And on the right side, we excluded the own voice. So this is without own voice. And if there is in color, there is coded the percentage of own voice in this 10-minute sections. So if the percentage is 0, then we see the bisecting line here, of course. If we have lots of own voice, then we see this kind of belly here. And this is, if you look at it, the form can really be well explained. We know that in higher exposure, we will not adapt our voice as much as we do in lower sound pressure levels. So the SNR will drop. It's exactly what we just learned. So in lower SNR, in low SPL situation, we will have a very good SNR. In high SPL situation, the SNR will not be as good. It's still individual. You see there's a wide spread here. And if you now go through one of those percentages, so if you just say, okay, I'm interested in the 90% percentile here for the 90% line for the sound pressure level here, then you can see it's something like this, and we average this, and you can see it here. So you can draw some conclusions out of it. At if the signal is very low, then you have to consider the own voice parts, or your estimate of the acoustic background will be biased. And the bias will be higher, of course, if there is more own voice. The other interesting part here is you can have a lower threshold because we cannot produce sound below a certain sound pressure level. But some would now see, oh, but there are some other points here. And this was the interesting part. We know that it is not possible to have a voiced sound below 40 dB. So we really needed to look at this data here, and it turns out this was someone who used this the system in a wrong way. It was hidden below a jacket or something, because the signal were really dull. You could see that in the power spectral densities. We cannot hear it because it's privacy protected, but in the power spectral densities, you can saw that there is the data is really dull, and something is the system itself was hidden somewhere. So this kind of diagram is really helpful in analyzing sound pressure level data. Okay, so to sum up my talk, what I hope I could just show you was that the Omega system is a very flexible tool for for EMA, and the good thing is everything is open source. Everything is on GitHub, and so you can really do changes. You can really improve the system. You can work on it. You can do your own stuff. If you need support, however, then it's slow. We are not a company. We have our own time constraints, and sometimes the support is marginal, to be honest. We try our best. We will support any user, but as I said, it takes time. What we really would like to do is to work together to build a common database so that we can pool data, and we are willing to host the data if you want to do studies with our system. Okay, on the second part, I hope I could show you some interesting results that Omega can be used to detect your own voice, and that this helps for analyzing the acoustic measurements, and that you have to really measure the own voice segments to get better results. Thank you for your attention.
So now we start the questions and answers part. So whoever wants to ask questions, go ahead. While it's looking a little bit blank, I guess I will just motivate you guys also to talk with each other and ask questions to each other. But maybe I can start by asking you, Jörg, a question. So this is open source and it's out there and people can use it. But what about the hardware part? Because you have a specific hardware part. So
good question.
Yeah.
The hardware can be bought by one of our colleagues. He is really building the hardware, but you can build it for yourself. The hardware designs and everything is on GitHub. So if you are able to do it, then you can build it for yourself. But if you are not, then you can ask Inga or myself, and then we will point you to our colleague. He was on the slide. It's Holger Gronewold.
And it's all off-the-shelf components, and you can access these components fairly easily, I guess.
During the last 2 years, it was not so easy to have access.
I know.
But usually, yes.
But you have to be very skilled in
procurement and yeah. All right. So Carolina was the first one to raise the hand. So go ahead, Carolina.
Yeah, I have a question for Jeppe. You said that most of your responses were self-initiated. I think I missed how often you prompted them, because it was an unusual result.
Yeah, I think that the app was set up so it would give you a prompt every morning at 8 if you didn't have your hearing aid on. And after that, it would prompt you pseudo randomly every hour or something like, no, I think 8 times a day or something like that. But I think it turned out that the prompting was either they missed them or it wasn't really working so well. So they were encouraged also to self-initiate. And that was actually fairly evenly distributed throughout the day, these initiations.
Okay.
Because so basically just going into the app and then testing out.
I'm just thinking that when we have prompted people around 7 times a day, then they also give self-initiated responses, but not that many, because they are sort of busy with what we have already prompted them to do. So I was interested in hearing, but then maybe the prompt didn't work as expected.
No, I think there was something there, or they missed it.
Okay.
These notifications come out very briefly and then they disappear.
Okay.
I know in Claudia's study I referred to, she also used the wristband that they were wearing to give them a little notification on it, so they could feel it also. And I actually, I'm not sure whether that helped or not, but it was an attempt at least.
Yeah.
But it's also the question when you call it self-initiated and when you call it prompted. Yes. Or how long is your time frame when you still say this is prompted? Our experience is similar to Carolina's, that people were more reacting to the prompts than doing self-initiated.
Yeah.
Yeah, I remember that we, Carolina, right, that we in one of our studies had sort of the first question, and the questionnaire would be, did you actually react to a prompt? So even if you sort of go much later in the questionnaire, you could always say, I heard the prompt like half an hour ago or something like this, and then I actually respond to that prompt. So in that case, it wouldn't be unprompted and not self-initiated, but they of course started the questionnaire later on themselves. So it's really a question of defining what is self-initiated and what is prompted.
Yeah, true.
Yeah, and that's also one of the problems, that sometimes if they respond to the prompted one, they don't really respond right there in the moment. They maybe do it later on because they have been told by the phone they have to respond. And I think it's a little bit better with the self-initiated ones, that part at least, because they know that they are supposed to just evaluate. Usually we say the last couple of minutes of their experiences when they do the rating. But
they didn't have any instructions for when to self-initiate, or?
They did. That was so. It was the people in Manchester. Gabby is writing something. The issue was that participants often didn't hear the prompts, and being conscientious study participants, they then decided to self-initiate. We had a question asking whether they were still in the environment. Yeah. So So I think they had some extra instructions of how to do that also.
And there was a comment from Gabby that self-initiate when they were in interesting listening situations.
Yeah. I wasn't a part of running the actual data collection, so she knows much more about that.
Thank you, Gabby.
Yeah, because you raised your hand.
Oh yeah, sorry, that was actually a question to York. What was it? No, I totally forgot it. Yeah, that was actually about this Omega system, because I've always wondered how intrusive do the participants actually feel it is, because when we ask them to wear maybe a wearable, even though it's not, a standard Garmin, it's a little bit chunkier than that, then they are fast to tell us that it's really uncomfortable and these things. Do you have any sort of like feedback or papers on this?
I think this is a question for Inga.
Actually, we don't have a paper on it, but we made the experience that when we called participants for the study, they would more often say, no, I'm not willing to participate. They were happy coming to the lab and do measurements there, which part of the Oldenburg inhabitants do regularly, more or less, but not to use a system like that in their everyday environment. So when you could name it dropouts, but yeah, they say the burden is too high, or they have other things going on in their everyday life and can't care about a system like that. That's definitely a drawback. Jule, who is also here in this conversation, in her PhD, we are trying to develop a system which is more easy to wear. But then it's not binaural, which is a drawback too.
So how do you suggest to use the Omega system with the hearing aid user at the moment? What's the best suggestion you can come up with? If that's a good question or not, I'm not sure.
Well, that has an historic background. First, we started with a system where we used microphones and hearing aid dummies, which were behind the ear, and then cables to a smartphone. And then, of course, we couldn't test BTE devices at the same time because there was already something behind the ear. So with this microphones on the glass temple, it's possible to wear hearing aids at the same time. So that was an advantage.
Okay, so then you use the two devices at the same time, and then they're kind of independent from each other, but maybe you can create some kind of test sequence where you instruct people how to do both at the same time. If, let's say, if you want to test two programs, in the other test is, I guess, Jeppe, you use the BLE to record or the app to record while people change programs, but in this case, it's a bit more manual. Or
yeah, it all has advantages and disadvantages.
Right, exactly.
So, you can use any hearing aid brand with the Omega system, but if you use only one brand, you have an advantage when you use the systems of the companies, because then you have more information about the hearing aids.
Right.
But at the same time, that's at least something we struggle a little bit with. That is, a hearing aid is not really made for collecting sound and giving it back to us. It's sort of like optimized for other things. So we often have struggles with the architects about, okay, we need to actually record this feature, and so yeah, that's the downside. We cannot really decide what kind of acoustic features we can get access to all the time.
I guess the good thing is that no matter what, the phone is always in the middle. So maybe as long as all the data arrives at the phone, maybe there could be some kind of symbiosis. I don't know. But there's a question here from Rodrigo. What consideration should be made to determine the frequency of prompting? Is there an optimal number of daily prompts? Whoever wants to answer.
I mean, we didn't test the awful different options. I think in one of the earlier studies, which I had the slide on, we prompted every 1.5 hours, and we always ask after the test. We ask people we have a short exit interview and ask them how intrusive that was and how they felt about having so many prompts and so on. And I remember that it was okay-ish for the 1.5 hours, and they did the test, and the compliance was as expected and was okay. But there were a couple of people who thought it was a little bit too high. And then in the following studies, we prompted every 2 hours, and there we saw lower ratings, and that it seemed totally fine. So, but that's all that we sort of tested. But we felt like we sort of landed in this sort of 2 hour-ish, 2 hours prompt interval.
I would say it also depends on the duration of the study. We also did studies where we prompted every half an hour, but then it was only for, like Jörg showed, for 4 days, because people were not willing, of course, to do that for 2 weeks. So it depends how long your study is.
And questionnaire length, of course, as well. If it takes like 30 seconds to answer the prompt or to answer the questionnaire, then it's of course a different thing. Then you have to sit 5 minutes to get through the questionnaire.
Actually, Niels even added here, is discussing the frequency of prompts the right question? Isn't the relevant question rather how we secure sufficient sampling of people's experiences? So that's also a good
I think to add to that, I think it's important, again, maybe reiterating what I said before in the talk, that if you use some statistical models that are appropriate for handling bias sample, like different kinds of sample sizes, so meaning that maybe you get few prompts from, or few assessment from one participant and a lot from another one, we need to have a way of weighing those two things so we don't really bias all the results. Because I think naturally we cannot ensure that everyone will give the same amount of prompts, and that's at least what we see typically, that there's always some participants that are really hesitant to give these EMAs. So I think also it's important to take it back to the analysis methods we apply.
But I think it is an important comment. I mean, we want to get a good feeling for what they are experiencing, and what we started off talking about is the burden for the test participants, which is something's a bit different. So it's it's burden or coverage, and how do we ensure that we cover what we want to cover.
I think we at least in some study evaluated the study length, so to speak, because we had the study where they had 2 different weeks of EMA, and we compared sort of the auditor reality between those 2 weeks and found that they were quite similar. So we nowadays have these recommendations to do at least a week, so to cover weekdays and weekends if you're interested in what we were interested. That seems to work quite well and cover what we are interested in. But the different research question can of course have a different need for frequencies of prompts and so on. And maybe just a quick comment regarding the burden, because I think we discussed it in the beginning as well, Carolina, because when using our own EMA system with the wide experience, we had this snack loop that people had to take with them, and it felt like they have to get a research phone, they probably have their own phone, they get the snack loop, and it's a lot of stuff they have to take with them. I don't think really that we had a tougher time recruiting people for that study, but we also discussed that given the fact that you have to take so much with you, sort of is also a sort of a reminder in the morning. I have to take the system with me, and then I take everything with me, and I'm on the study. If you would ask people to install the app on their own phone, and that's it, they might have their routines where they have the phone, they might forget to take it here and there, and maybe you don't get the compliance that you would like to. So there's pros and cons with having additional equipment with you.
I'm also thinking that it worked well, as you said, but that is for people who have signed up to be test participants in research. If you do anything more clinically relevant, then there are other requirements, of course, for the systems.
Well, if nobody has anything more to add, we already exceeded a few minutes. I just want to say thank you very much for participating in this webinar. It's been a pleasure. And everybody, this will be online for people to see, and they will also get an email with the presentations and everything. So, and there's a survey at the end, so if you can spend that minute, we really appreciate it. And thank you to everyone, and have a lovely day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye,
Have a nice
guys.
day. Bye.
Bye.